Only half of Americans, according to a 1999 Gallup poll, could correctly name the first man to walk on the moon. That's not a trivia failure. That's what happens when 6 missions, 12 men, and thousands of hours of planning get flattened into one grainy black and white memory. Here's what most people believe: that a moonwalk was a moonwalk, one broadcast that basically looked the same every time. It didn't. The first man on the moon spent 20 minutes photographing a plaque and 20 hours total on the surface before flying home. The last man spent 22 hours and 4 minutes actually outside the spacecraft, across 3 separate excursions, in a valley chosen because it might hold answers the first landing never had time to look for. That gap, 9 times the outside time, across 3 years, is the whole story this video is going to walk you through, mission by mission, minute by minute. I went through the mission logs of all 6 landings, every EVA transcript NASA has released, and the biographies of all 12 men who stepped onto that surface, to put every timestamp and every distance in one place for the first time. Most people assume Apollo 11 set the template every later mission just repeated with a bigger rover. It didn't. Every single moonwalk after Neil and Buzz's boot prints was engineered to break the previous one's record. More time, more ground, more risk, and by the end, one of those records still hasn't been touched in 54 years. Of the 12 men who did this, only a handful are still with us. And somewhere in the recordings NASA sat on for decades, there's a farewell spoken by the last human being to stand on the moon. A line he said he believed history itself would record. You won't hear his name yet, but by the end, you'll hear exactly what he said, standing in a valley surrounded by the blackest black he'd ever seen. Picture a commander leaning out of a hatch 240,000 miles from home, not stepping onto the surface yet, just looking, describing, photographing, because the mission plan called for him to survey the ground before anyone's boots touched it. That's how the richest, most ambitious moonwalking mission of the entire program began. Apollo 15, July 1971. David Scott and James Irwin. And before either man took a single step, Scott spent 33 minutes doing something no earlier crew had done. A stand-up EVA, popping the top hatch of the lunar module Falcon, and describing the terrain around him while the camera and his own eyes mapped out what came next. NASA's own record puts the window at 0 hours, 16 minutes, 49 seconds, to 0 hours, 49 minutes, 56 seconds, UTC, on July 31st, 1971, and one of the panorama shots Scott took during those 33 minutes caught something the crew wouldn't be able to see again once the sun angle changed. Clear evidence of rock layering, stratigraphy, on the ridge they'd nicknamed Silver Spur. Apollo 15 was NASA's first J mission, which meant something specific. 3 full moonwalks instead of 2, a longer stay, and for the first time a car. The Lunar Roving Vehicle changed everything about what these 2 men could reach. Extravehicular activity. One started at 13 hours, 12 minutes, and 17 seconds. Universal time on July 31st, 1971, and ran until 19 hours, 45 minutes, and 59 seconds. Scott and Irwin unloaded the rover, tested it, and drove it 10.3 kilometers out to the edge of Hadley Rill, past Elbow Crater, close to St. George Crater, a sinuous canyon carved into the moon that no human being had ever stood beside. They finished the walk with a 3-meter core sample punched into the regolith near the lander. The next day, extravehicular activity 2 ran from 11 hours, 48 minutes, and 48 seconds to 19 hours, 1 minute, and 2 seconds universal time, and this one pushed even further, 12.5 kilometers along the base of the Apennine Mountains, hitting 5 named craters in sequence: Index, Arbate, Crescent, Dune, and Spur, before circling back to the ALS-EP science station. NASA would later describe Scott and Irwin as interplanetary mountaineers, and that's not a poetic stretch. They were working the lower slopes of an actual lunar mountain, Mons Hadley Delta, the same way a geologist works a hillside in Wyoming. except the sky above them was black at noon. Extravehicular Activity 3 on August 2nd ran from 8 hours, 52 minutes, and 14 seconds to 13 hours, 42 minutes, and 4 seconds Universal Time, a shorter 5.1-kilometer loop out to Scarp Crater and back along the rill's edge. 3 extravehicular activities, 10.3 kilometers, then 12.5, then 5.1, a mission that front-loaded its ambition and then brought itself home. Apollo 15 proved something the program badly needed, that with a rover and enough training, 2 men could do serious field geology on another world, not just plant a flag and grab rocks within walking distance. That template, 3 extravehicular activities, real mileage, real science, became the standard for everything that came after it. But the 2 missions that came before Apollo 15 didn't have any of that. They had far less time, far less distance, and a much harder road just getting to the surface at all. Some missions get remembered for what happened on the way down. Apollo 12 is one of them, and by the time Pete Conrad and Alan Bean actually stood on the surface, they'd already survived the hardest part. Twice on the way up, lightning struck the spacecraft and the telemetry in Houston turned to noise. It was a young controller, John Aaron, who talked the crew through the recovery, and Alan Bean was the one who knew which switch to throw. That crisis is well documented. The moonwalks that followed carried the reward for surviving it. Apollo 12 landed on November 19, 1969, only 4 months after Apollo 11, and NASA classified it as an H mission. Conrad and Bean spent roughly 31.5 hours with the lunar module Intrepid parked in the ocean of storms, but the time they actually spent outside walking was far shorter and far more precise than that. EVA-1 ran 3 hours and 56 minutes, EVA-2 ran 3 hours and 49 minutes, 7 hours and 45 minutes total. Conrad had put Intrepid down with such precision, 535 feet from the robotic Surveyor 3 probe that had soft landed there 2.5 years earlier, that the extra EVA existed specifically to let the crew walk over and cut pieces off it, to see what 2.5 years of lunar exposure does to a machine. But EVA-2 is remembered on the record for something else entirely. About 2.5 hours into that second walk, Bean flipped a page in the small flipbook checklist strapped to his spacesuit cuff and found a photograph that had no business being there. Back on Earth, the backup crew, Dave Scott and Jim Irwin, the very men who'd be standing on Hadley Rill 18 months later, had secretly laminated 2 Playboy centerfolds into the checklist pages, hidden among the sample collection instructions, each one paired with a geology pun as its caption. Conrad found his own a few pages later. Neither man said a word about it over the open channel. They kept working, and NASA didn't find out until the checklist came home and got compared page by page decades afterward. It's the kind of detail that never made the broadcast. 2 men, 250,000 miles from the nearest joke, laughing into their helmets where no one could hear it. That's the shape of Apollo 12's moonwalks. 2 EVAs, under 8 hours of actual walking, a mission built around proving a pinpoint landing was possible, and a crew who couldn't resist turning the walk into a prank nobody would catch for years. That kind of precision meant a lot for what followed, because the next landing had to prove that precision could survive an actual crisis of its own. No mission before or after carried the weight this one did. Because before Alan Shepard and Edgar Mitchell ever set foot on the moon, an oxygen tank on the previous flight had ruptured on the way there, and the entire program stopped to ask itself whether it should keep going at all. Apollo 14 flew in February 1971, directly after the aborted Apollo 13 mission, and NASA kept it in the same H mission class as Apollo 12. Shepard and Mitchell spent about 33.5 hours with the lunar module Antares on the ground at Fra Mauro, and their 2 EVAs totaled 9 hours and 22 minutes outside. EVA-1 ran 4 hours and 48 minutes, EVA-2 ran 4 hours and 35 minutes. That continuity mattered. After a mission that never landed at all, NASA could have scaled back. It didn't. This is Alan Shepard's mission, and it's worth sitting with what it took just to get him here. He was the first American in space back in 1961, and then NASA grounded him for years over an inner ear condition before an experimental surgery brought his flight status back. Mauro made him, by many accounts, the oldest man to walk on the moon at the time. At 47 years old, EVA 2 nearly became the mission's real crisis. Shepard and Mitchell set out pulling a two-wheeled equipment cart toward the rim of Cone Crater, a target NASA badly wanted for its exposed bedrock. But the terrain at Fra Mauro was a field of overlapping small craters and boulders with no consistent horizon to navigate by, and the two men lost track of exactly where they were. Their heart rates climbed, their oxygen ran down, and Houston finally called them back before either man could confirm they'd ever actually reached the rim. Photo analysis done years later suggested they'd gotten within about 65 feet of it and simply couldn't tell. What Shepard did next on the way back to Antares is the detail everyone remembers and almost nobody remembers correctly. He pulled out a 6-iron head he'd smuggled aboard, fitted it to a sample collection handle, and hit 2 golf balls one-handed in his stiff, pressurized suit. He told the ground on live audio that the second one went miles and miles. A 2021 photographic analysis matching the balls against the terrain in the footage put the real distances at about 24 and 40 yards, remarkable in a suit that barely let him swing with 2 hands but a universe away from what became the legend. What holds firm in the record is the classification. 2 full moonwalks, 9 hours and 22 minutes on foot. 1 crew that got lost within sight of their objective and still turned the walk back into a punchline, immediately following the closest call the program ever had. The plan survived. The astronauts survived. And 3 missions later, the plan itself would change completely. By the time John Young and Charles Duke reached the moon, NASA had settled on a new formula entirely, and this mission was built to test it in the hardest terrain the program had chosen yet. Apollo 16 flew in April 1972, classified as a J mission. Just like Apollo 15, 3 EVAs, 71 hours on the lunar surface, 20 hours and 14 minutes of that spent actually outside. EVA 1 ran about 7 hours and 11 minutes, EVA 2 ran 7 hours and 23 minutes, and EVA 3, cut short by a 6-hour landing delay earlier in the mission, ran 5 hours and 40 minutes. But where Apollo 15 worked mountains and a reel, Apollo 16 was sent somewhere different. It's remembered as Apollo's only pure highlands mission, a landing site chosen specifically because it sat away from the smooth volcanic plains every previous crew had touched down on. About 4 hours into EVA 1, Young and Duke drove the rover to Plum Crater, a small pit on the rim of the larger Flag Crater, and Houston radioed down a specific request: pick up that rock. Duke found himself looking at something the size of a watermelon, too heavy to lift with one arm. He put his scoop down, rolled the boulder up against his leg, and cradled it back to the rover like, in his own words, a little baby. It weighed 11.7 kilograms when it got home, the largest single rock the entire Apollo program ever brought back from the moon. The geology team nicknamed it Big Muley, after their field leader, and it rode the rest of the traverse wedged under Duke's seat because nothing else on the rover could hold it. That 3 EVA 71-hour pattern was the same one Apollo 15 had pioneered and Apollo 17 would use again, the standard the final stretch of the program settled into. The mission's purpose was clear even where the day-by-day record is thin elsewhere. Prove the highlands held different geology than the Mare Basins, a question worth answering before the program ended for good, and one 1,900-pound highland boulder went a long way toward answering it. And that question of purpose is exactly where the story has to circle back, because before any of these later missions existed, There was one landing that had almost none of this ambition and all of the risk. Every mission after this one had more time, more distance, more ground covered. This one had 20 hours, one single moonwalk, and the entire weight of a nation's promise riding on it. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed the lunar module Eagle in the Sea of Tranquility in July 1969, and NASA classified Apollo 11 as a G mission, 20 hours on the surface, one EVA. Compare that to what Scott and Irwin would do 2 years later at Hadley Ryle, or what Young and Duke would do in the Descartes Highlands. Apollo 11 wasn't built for extended field geology. It was built to prove the entire premise of the program, that a human being could leave a spacecraft, stand on another world, and come back alive. So Armstrong climbed down first and reached the bottom of the ladder and said something that became the most repeated sentence of the 20th century. Here's the detail almost nobody talks about. The National Archives, which holds the original flight transcripts, states plainly that the recording failed to capture Armstrong's exact words. The debate over whether he said one small step for man or one small step for a man isn't internet trivia. It's baked into the actual government record, an ambiguity that sat unresolved for decades inside the most famous sentence in spaceflight history. What is precisely recorded is what Armstrong read next, off a plaque mounted on the leg of the lunar module itself. Here man from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969. A D. We came in peace for all mankind. No ambiguity there. Those words are engraved in aluminum, sitting in the Sea of Tranquility right now, and they'll outlast every one of us. The scientists compiling Apollo 11's geologic transcript afterward said they worked hard not to lose the personal and philosophical aspects of this intensely human experience, even while stripping out routine housekeeping chatter. That's a strange thing to have to decide. Which parts of a man's first hours on another world count as data, and which count as feeling? They tried to keep both. 20 hours on the surface, one EVA, no rover, no long traverses, no named craters strung together in a loop. Just one long, unbroken message to everyone watching. This is possible. Every mission that came after built on that single fact. And the last one would spend that inheritance more completely than any of them, in a valley chosen specifically because it might hold answers the first landing never had time to look for. 3 moonwalks, 22 hours outside the spacecraft, 19.3 nautical miles driven, and at the end of it, one man alone on the surface of another world, about to say something he believed history itself would remember. Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt landed at Taurus Littrow in December 1972, on a site chosen because geologists expected it to hold both ancient highland material and much younger volcanic deposits in the same valley. That gamble paid off. Apollo 17 brought home 243.65 pounds of lunar samples, the largest return of the entire program, and it did it across a record that still stands. 3 surface EVAs totaling 22 hours, 3 minutes, and 57 seconds outside the lunar module. EVA 1 began at 11:54 and 49 seconds p.m. on December 11, 1972, with Cernan stepping onto the surface 6 minutes later. It ran 7 hours and 12 minutes, and in it the crew unloaded the rover, planted the flag, deployed a full suite of surface experiments, and drove a deep core sample out of the ground. EVA-2, starting at 11:28 and 6 seconds p.m. the next night, stretched to 7 hours and 37 minutes, the longest single EVA in human history at that time. They drove further from their spacecraft than any human beings ever had, 7.6 kilometers at the outer edge, deploying explosive charges for seismic profiling and working station after station across the valley floor. Then came EVA-3. It began at 10:25 and 48 seconds p.m. on December 13th, and it was scheduled to be the last time in the Apollo program that human boots would touch lunar soil. Nobody knew. that night that it would still be true more than 50 years later. Here is that final hour. By 2019, the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11, Gallup found a record 64% of Americans saying the space program's costs were justified, with the total price of Apollo now reframed at roughly $177 billion in today's money, treated less as an expense and more as the down payment on entire industries. In that same 2019 survey, 66% of Americans could correctly name Armstrong as the first man to walk on the moon, up from just 50% 20 years earlier in 1999. Some of that shift came from material nobody had ever heard before. NASA had recorded thousands of hours of audio during Apollo 11 alone, most of it never released, sitting untouched in storage for decades. In the late 2010s, researchers digitized roughly 19,000 hours of it, building software to detect speech and separate speakers well enough to transcribe conversations at 60 to 97% accuracy, opening up Mission Control's private moments to the public for the first time. Meanwhile, NASA's own Apollo Lunar Surface Journal, first assembled in the 1990s and still updated on the agency's website, today stitched together corrected transcripts, photographs, and commentary from 10 of the 12 men who'd actually walked on the moon, turning scattered mission audio into the closest thing the program has to a living memory. What almost got lost wasn't the achievement, it was the sound of the men who did it, thinking out loud, 250,000 miles from home. There's a piece of Apollo 17 this video never touched. 9 days after Cernan spoke his last words on the surface, on the way back to Earth, Ron Evans opened the hatch of the command module and went outside, not to walk on anything, but to retrieve film canisters floating in deep space, a full hour and 6 minutes tethered to a spacecraft between two worlds. That's an EVA, nobody counts as a moonwalk, and it's a different kind of story from anything covered here. What it takes for a career to survive being grounded, sidelined, or written off, and fight its way back to a mission. That's exactly what the next video on this channel explains. Go watch every astronaut who was grounded and fought to fly again explain now.